Hi BookTube! I'm here with my favorite fiction reads of 2020. Disclaimer, I really don't think any of these books were published in 2020. So if you're looking for like best books published in 2020, you might want to go somewhere else. These are just the best books that I read this year. And there's going to be an honorable mention and a little warning, because you shouldn't assemble your best of list before you're finished reading all of your books. And I did that, and I'm reading a book right now, and I'm just like 40 pages from the end, and unless something goes horribly wrong, this book is amazing. So I just want to talk about it quickly. It's kind of my honorable mention outside of this top 10 list here. And that is A Gathering of Waters by Bernice L. McFadden. And it is about a town called Money, Mississippi. And it's actually narrated by the town. Like, it's not by people in the town, but by the town. And concentrating on the black families in that town. And over a period of time, I believe it starts in the 1910s and 1920s. And goes forward to the 1990s, actually. And it is so good. It is just so readable. Like, I didn't want to put this book down. Every time I picked it up, I was just like, you know, losing track of time, and just had to put it down because, you know, I had other things to do. But if there were no other things to do, I would have just kept reading this book. It was just so incredibly readable. So these are in no particular order, except I'm saving my favorite book of the year for last. So first I'm going to talk about An Unrested Woman by Shobha Rao. And this is actually a series of short stories about mostly Indian women and one Indian man. So it's about relationships, mostly romantic relationships, not always loving ones though. So really fascinating. It actually featured many LGBT plus stories as well. It's also about displacement geographically. We were talking about partition at times, which, if you don't know, is when the world and England kind of decided that Pakistan and India would be two separate places, and it caused a bunch of chaos. So there's displacement there. The title actually is referring to something that happened when women ended up on the wrong side of that border and were not restored back to their country where they were supposed to be. And also talking about displacement geographically in terms of immigration. So moving from India and Pakistan to the Americas mostly. It's also both socially and culturally being displaced, you know, being gay in unaccepting and dangerous times, being forced into a marriage or being forced into prostitution, or even time. We follow one story is about a man with dementia who's living in the past but walking in the present, and there's that kind of displacement. Oh, it's just really good to see that theme running throughout. It's a mix of short stories, but characters, themes, plots are kind of all interconnected, so it's best to read it as a whole. There are characters from, you know, previous stories who show up in other stories. There are certain ones that stick out and kind of set the tone for the whole series, in my opinion. The first one is the title story, An Unrested Woman, and this is about a woman who ends up on the wrong side of the border after partition and gets separated from her husband, and she ends up in a refugee camp and ends up falling in love with a woman, which is something that she at first doesn't want to acknowledge is happening, but when it does, it's life-changing. And also Blindfold, which is about a woman who starts a brothel. She buys young girls from poor people, and she's kind of feeling conflicted between supporting herself, because this is one of the only acceptable things for a single woman to do, trying to be independent within the constraints of her own culture, but also, you know, you also hate her at the same time for exploiting young girls. And, you know, they were beaten and raped. So there's this conflict going on of like, this woman is trying to do what she can, but has to exploit other people in order to do that. It's, you know, it really makes you think about things. Yeah, so that's An Unrested Woman by Shobha Rao. Number 2 is actually 2 books, but they're from the same series, and it's Malazan. Books number 2 and 3 in the series, Dead House Gates and Memories of Ice. If you put a gun to my head and made me choose, I'd have to say Memories of Ice was better than Dead House Gates, but they're both phenomenal novels. and these are by Steven Erikson. This series just gets better and better with each book. Like, I thought Gardens of the Moon was really good, and then I read Dead House Gates and I was like, this is even better, and then I read Memories of Ice and I was like, oh my god, this is even better, and now House of Chains is going to be next, and I'm hoping that that climb just gets better and better. I love that Erikson trusts his readers to navigate the world without holding their hands. Like, he just kind of drops you in the middle of the action and says, figure it out. I'm not doing anything for you. You're just running along, and you're running, and you don't know what you're running from, and you don't know what you're running towards, and you just gotta, you know, go with it. Yeah, this is an epic fantasy series about the Malazan Empire, and it's just kind of like a history of the empire. So it's not necessarily continuous. Actually, I believe the third book jumps backwards timeline-wise from the second book, and then we jump forward again in House of Chains, which is the fourth book, which I haven't read yet. I'm talking about it, but I haven't read it yet, but I know the timeline is all over the place, but it makes sense in the way it's done. So for example, the characters and events in the first book are not featured in the second book, but they do return in the third book. And the events in the second book are not continued in the third book, but they're continued in the fourth book. And it sounds really confusing, but it all makes sense. Just trust. And the writing is great. So for example, he, in one scene, he incorporated a matching rhythm in the writing into a scene where people are walking. And he kind of emphasized the steps with the alliteration. And I just like looked at that and went, wow, this is really good. The characters are so much fun, and their names reflect that as well. We have characters named Whiskey Jack, Quick Ben, Tattersail, Fiddler, you know, kind of fun, quirky names that add that kind of sense of humor into this very intense reading experience. The magic system is also one of the best magic systems I've ever read. It's portal magic. So magic users kind of open a portal into another world and draw power from that. And they can also travel through those portals to kind of quick travel or to escape enemies and stuff like that. It's really cool. And there's this whole mythology at the same time going on with gods and historical figures and legends, and then how time changes these mythologies and how they affect their culture. It's such in-depth world building, and there's no info dumps. You just kind of pick things up as they're happening organically. I can go on and on about this series. Number 3 is Reproduction by Ian Williams. This is about an unconventional family. So we begin with Felicia, who's a recent immigrant to Canada from an unnamed island nation, and Edgar, the child of a wealthy German family, who meet in a hospital where both their mothers are dying. And then life happens, and it's about biological families and found families. And the book is about reproduction also in the biological sense, but also in the text itself, as it kind of multiplies in sections. So for example, in the beginning there are 23 sections, one for each of the chromosome pairs of DNA. That's told in a fairly conventional fashion. But by the end of the book, we're getting multiple stories told at once, you know, interspersed with thoughts and kind of super text. You know, this is representing how our cells are constantly replicating. And I read one review that said it was like a cancer. Like the cells just kept going and going, and you're getting all these splotches of text, and, you know, you got to pay attention. And I love experimental writing in books. And I'm even more impressed when the experimentation reflects the themes in the plot, and this book did that phenomenally well. Number 4 is Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi. And this is about a young woman, Ada, who was born with one foot in another world. That's how the book is described. This results in her being fractured. So she has these other selves within her. The two most prominent ones are Ashigara and St. Vincent, as well as the Unnamed Collective. And this deals with some tough topics such as body and gender dysmorphia, sexual assault, mental health issues, in such a real way, but also in such a surreal way as well, because we have these other selves within Ada that are, you know, doing certain things and dealing with it in different ways. And it's fascinating and so well written, and the writing is so beautiful and kind of reflects the magicalness of the plot. Then here we have a comic, and I said after reading this comic that it was going to make this list, and it did, and that's The Gigantic Beard That Was Evil by Stephen Collins. This book is awesome. I actually want a physical copy of this book, but I'm on a book buying ban for the rest of the year. So, 2022, I'm getting myself a book. So as I said, this is a comic. It's about a world called Here that is very strict, very orderly, very neat, and beardless. Until one day, a man discovers that he is growing a beard that refuses to be cut. It's about a world ruled by the fear of there, not here. A fear of the different, a fear of not being in control. It's about embracing being different, about not being afraid, and to be more open-minded. And I loved the message of this book. It's a crazy out there story about this beard that grows uncontrollably and a world that tries to bring it under control and fails. It's a great moral told in a crazy way, and I think there's something in this story for everyone. Number 6 is actually a whole series, and that is a manga series called Made in Abyss by Akihito Takushi, and oh man, I watched the anime before reading the manga with my brother, and the anime gets it really close, but the manga just, you know, has those little extra bits. So this is about a world that has a giant pit in it, and that pit draws adventurers to it. And the pit is the abyss. It goes down, like you can't see the bottom of this thing. And there's different levels in the pit, and the catch is that you can descend no problem. You can keep going down. But as soon as you try to go up, even if you're walking up a set of stairs in the same level, you're going to be hit with problems and consequences that will physically affect your body. So for example, coming up from the first level makes you kind of nauseous and dizzy, and that's, you know, you can deal with it. Coming up from the 4th level makes you bleed from every orifice and gives you intense pain. It won't kill you, but you know, it'll hurt pretty bad. Coming up from the 6th level will strip you of your humanity. So you'll still be alive, but you'll not necessarily be in the same form. And the thought is that you also won't have a soul. And past that level, you can't ascend without dying. So not only does each level come with that, but it also comes with challenges like creatures that will kill and eat you, or cave raiders who have remained descended for so long that they've gone mad. And we follow a 12-year-old girl and her robot friend as they want to descend right to the bottom in search of her mother, who they are convinced is down there waiting for them. In the very last level, and the manga's ongoing, so they haven't hit the bottom yet. And I want to keep reading as it gets translated and published first in Japanese and then translated. And this manga, the key to it is not just the story and these different horrible things that are going on, but the way it plays with emotion. This is such an emotional graphic work. It poses such interesting moral questions, you know, alongside the pains of growing up, because we're following 12-year-olds kind of being now faced with adult, you know, things happening to them. You know, they're going through puberty, but they're also dealing with these really adult situations. And, you know, you have that high intensity of the emotions during puberty, and then the high intentions that, you know, even adults would have, but even intensified because of their age. And it's also very scary and stressful, but enjoyable and challenging at the same time. Number 7 is The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin, and this is about 2 planets that kind of orbit each other. One is very Earth-like, most of the world's capitalist, it's driven by money, and that's called Uras. And the other is an anarchy communist world where there's no money and theoretically no one person in power, and that's called Anaris. And we follow Shevik, who is a man from Anaris who travels to Uras to further his work in physics and try to spread the way of Anaris on this other planet. And we follow alternate chapters, so we'll follow one chapter of him on Anaris growing up and kind of explaining that world and how it is, and then him being on Uras as an adult and exploring how that is. And I really appreciated that Le Guin wasn't heavily biased towards one political philosophy or the other. You know, both planets had their benefits and their faults, and she showed that very well. So it was an exploration of both philosophies, and I really appreciated that. And it was also very interesting enough framework in the plots and the characters I found. I highly recommend this book if you're, it's not, I guess it is a little heavy on the science because we are following a physicist, but it's more focusing on the politics of the place. Number 8 is Beloved by Toni Morrison. This is my first Toni Morrison, and this book blew me out of the water. This is about a woman named Setha who escapes slavery and is haunted by the lingering reverberations of it. And that's all I'm going to say about the plot, because I think it's best going into this book not knowing too much about it. I loved it because of how it mixes the seemingly quiet family story, and I love like quiet stories, you know, not big huge events happening, like just kind of following a family and their everyday kind of life. But it mixes this with this kind of horrifying dread that's there in the background. Like you're constantly, you know, feeling that kind of tenseness that something bad happened and is going to happen. And it's there and it builds, and but you've also got like this nice story of like this family. You're just like, okay, like something's gonna happen. And the writing is just beautiful. Again, she trusts her reader to put the pieces together without spelling everything out. And so you definitely have to like stick it out to get the story. Like there's hints dropped here and there. And you're just like, is it or is it not? Like, is this real? Or is this just something else going on? Is there another explanation for this? And you don't really find out until the end. And even really, you don't really find out. And I really liked that dread, that tenseness that I felt with it, because it was also interspersed with moments of humor and human kindness, and so it wasn't completely, you know, depressing and horrible to read. It was, you know, reading about these awesome people like Baby Shugs. I wish I'd known someone like that in real life. Yeah, interspersed with like this horrible dread going on. Just that balance is amazing. Okay, the 9th book on this list is Points of Origin by lots of different people. I'm not going to list all the authors. It's an anthology, and to be honest, this one is on here solely because it's a Stargate collection, and I love Stargate. There could be some of the worst written stories in this book, and they're not, actually. I really enjoyed most of them, but it would still be on this list. I would still love it because I love Stargate so much. So if you don't know, the Stargate universe is about these giant circular gates that allow people to travel to different planets almost instantaneously. Like you walk through it, you're on Earth, and then you're in another galaxy. In the SG-1, there's 2. We only talk about the 2 Stargates. Stargate SG-1 and Stargate Atlantis. And they're the only ones featured in this collection. So the SG-1 team have their base on Earth, and their primary villain is the Goa'uld, which are parasitic aliens which attach themselves onto humans and are actually the Egyptian gods. So they're not actual gods, but they came to Earth and pretended to be the Egyptian gods. So they have names like Ra and Isis and that. And the Atlantis team is based in the Pegasus galaxy on the mythical city of Atlantis. And their primary villain is the Wraith, which are the dominant species in the galaxy, and they feed off of humans. They have like this slit in their hand, and they kind of like suck the energy out of a human, to the point like if they stopped and pulled away, you'd have aged. It's complicated, not fully explained, but it's awesome. And this is a collection of short stories that take place in both the SG-1 team and the Atlantis team, and each story reads like an episode of the show, which is why I love it, because it's like new episodes. I've watched so much SG-1 and Atlantis so many times that it's so nice to get new episodes, even though they're stories instead of visual media. Yeah, it's just, that's why it's on the list. It couldn't not be on the list. And now my favorite book of 2020. As soon as I finished this book, I was like, wow. And I ordered a physical copy because I was listening to it on audiobook, and I was just so glad to have this book on my shelf. And it's called Owls Do Cry by Janet Frame. And it's about a young woman who has schizophrenia and is sent to a mental health hospital. And her name is Daphne, but her story is actually told through the story of her siblings, with kind of snippets of her voice coming from what's called the dead room. You know, she intersperses here and there in between the stories, but the stories of her siblings are kind of the stories of her. It's so well done. If you're going to read this book, you're going to read it for characterization. Not much happens plot-wise, but the characters are amazing. So we follow two of Daphne's sisters, Francie and Chicks, and her brother Toby. Well, she's kind of like a shadow kind of lurking throughout the story. The family comes from a working class background, which is another thing that I love reading about, which is always, you know, I find it's refreshing to read that because it creates limits for what characters can do and actually makes them more interesting people to me. And there's also here an interesting story about the author. She was actually scheduled to have a lobotomy after being diagnosed with schizophrenia herself. And the day before her surgery, her collection of stories called The Lagoon and Other Stories won one of the most prestigious literary awards in New Zealand. And they said, oh, like, we can't lobotomize this woman. She is a genius. And I agree. Like, she went on to write Owls Do Cry, and it is amazing, amazing. So this is definitely an own voices book when it comes to mental health, especially in being in an institution. Yeah, it's just a phenomenal book. Yeah, and those are my favorite books of 2020. Let me know what your favorite book was, and thank you for reading. and thank you for watching.